At her peak, Elizabeth Holmes was hailed as a $4.5 billion self-made billionaire. Today, according to CNN and Theranos' own criminal case record, she's serving more than 11 years in federal prison for fraud. How did a revolutionary blood test turn into one of the most expensive lies in Silicon Valley history? Elizabeth Holmes didn't start as a villain in a courtroom. According to her biography on Wikipedia, she founded Theranos in 2003 when she was still in her teens, with one big promise: to revolutionize blood testing. The pitch, as summarized on both the Holmes and Theranos Wikipedia pages, was seductive. Theranos claimed it had invented a way to run hundreds of lab tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick, instead of a traditional vial drawn from your vein. Faster results, cheaper tests, painless experience, the perfect Silicon Valley health tech story. By the early 2010s, that story took off. Fortune ran a glowing profile in 2014 under the headline, "This CEO is out for blood," describing how Theranos was supposedly bringing painless blood testing to pharmacies, including Walgreens, based on the company's own claims about its technology. Business Insider later described how the startup's hype helped push its valuation as high as $9 billion over a 15-year span. According to Elizabeth Holmes's Wikipedia entry, in 2015, Forbes named Holmes the youngest and wealthiest self-made female billionaire in the United States. On paper, based on that $9 billion valuation, her personal net worth was pegged at around $4.5 billion. On the outside, Theranos looked untouchable: a visionary founder, a star-studded board, a huge partnership with Walgreens, and a product that sounded like magic. But as several sources note, what really supported that $9 billion valuation wasn't transparent data or audited revenues. It was belief. Investors poured in more than $700 million, according to charges later brought by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, largely on the back of Theranos' own claims about its supposedly game-changing technology. And that's the key financial setup here: billions in value, built on technology that almost nobody outside the company had actually verified. On paper, Theranos had everything: money, prestige, and distribution. According to the Theranos and Holmes Wikipedia pages, Walgreens signed on as a major partner and even rolled out Theranos blood testing centers in its stores, before ultimately terminating the relationship in 2016. Articles like the Fortune profile and a Pharmacy Times piece titled, "Bringing Painless Blood Testing to the Pharmacy," helped cement the image that Theranos was already delivering on its promise. Investors and the media weren't just buying a product, they were buying a narrative. Holmes cultivated an image of a mission-driven genius entrepreneur. According to Business Insider's review of Theranos' rise and fall, this narrative helped elevate Theranos from a niche lab startup into a Silicon Valley unicorn valued in the billions. Behind the scenes, however, the core money question remained unanswered. What exactly was the technology doing? And did it work the way Theranos said it did? The SEC would later allege, in charges summarized by CNN Business and on Holmes' Wikipedia page, that Theranos, Holmes, and former COO Ramesh Sunny Balwani raised around $700 million from investors through what the SEC called a massive fraud. The regulator claimed they did this by making an elaborate, years-long series of false or exaggerated statements about the company's technology, business, and financial performance. One specific allegation, reported by CNN Business, was that Holmes and Balwani knew Theranos' proprietary analyzer could perform only 12 of the over 200 tests it offered on its patient menu, a huge gap between promise and reality. But at this stage, most outsiders didn't know any of that. Investors saw a charismatic founder, top-tier board members, and early commercial deals. That was enough for big money to overlook the simplest due diligence question: show me the data. Every great financial implosion starts the same way: quiet doubts. According to the Holmes and Theranos Wikipedia entries, the decline of Theranos began around 2015, when journalistic and regulatory investigations started probing the company's claims. Reporters and regulators asked basic questions about accuracy, reliability, and whether Theranos was in compliance with lab testing regulations. As those questions mounted, so did the pressure. In 2016, Walgreens, the retail giant that had banked on Theranos to transform its in-store clinics, terminated its relationship with the startup, as noted in both the trial summary and Theranos history. Regulators followed. CNN Business reports that in April 2017, Theranos settled with the U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS. Theranos agreed to pay $30,000 and, more importantly, agreed not to own or operate any clinical labs for 2 years, a devastating outcome for a company built around lab testing. That same month, according to CNN Business, Theranos also settled with the Arizona Attorney General. The Arizona AG had alleged that Theranos' advertising misrepresented the method, accuracy, and reliability of its blood testing, and that the company violated federal clinical lab regulations. As part of that settlement, Theranos agreed to pay about $4.65 million back to Arizona customers. By now, the damage to Theranos' financial story was obvious. A company once worth $9 billion, according to Forbes' original valuation, was facing regulatory sanctions, lost partnerships, and refund obligations. Forbes would later revise Elizabeth Holmes's net worth to zero in 2016, as accusations of fraud about the company's claims became public, according to her Wikipedia page. But the biggest hit was still coming, and it would come from the very investors who had once made Holmes a paper billionaire. By 2018, Theranos wasn't just a failed startup. It was a federal case. According to CNN Business and Holmes's Wikipedia entry, in March 2018, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charged Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, and Sunny Balwani with what it called a massive fraud involving more than $700 million raised from investors. The SEC alleged that Holmes and Balwani exaggerated or made false statements about Theranos' technology, business, and financial performance over years. The SEC also alleged, as CNN Business reports, that Holmes and Balwani knew Theranos' proprietary analyzer could perform only a fraction of the tests that the company advertised to patients. That gap between public promises and internal reality is what turned a business failure into a fraud case. Holmes chose to settle the SEC's civil charges without admitting or denying the allegations. According to the Holmes Wikipedia page, she agreed to pay a $500,000 fine, return 18.9 million shares to Theranos, relinquish her voting control, and accept a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of a public company. But that wasn't the end of her legal trouble. On the criminal side, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Holmes and Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy, as reported by outlets including The Washington Post, The Guardian, and the DOJ itself, all cited on Holmes and the Theranos trial Wikipedia pages. CNN Business notes that both Holmes and Balwani were ultimately tried separately. Holmes' trial culminated in January 2022. According to the Theranos Wikipedia page, a jury found her guilty of 4 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. She was later sentenced in November 2022 to 11 years and 3 months in prison. Theranos' Wikipedia entry reports that she began serving that sentence on May 30, 2023, at Federal Prison Camp, Bryan, in Texas. Balwani, tried later, was convicted of 12 counts of fraud in July 2022 and sentenced in December to 12 years and 11 months in prison, plus 3 years of probation. A BBC report on her failed appeal notes that Holmes recently lost a challenge to her conviction and 11-plus-year sentence. The court rejected arguments about the trial evidence and her ex-partner, Balwani's level of responsibility. At this point, the financial autopsy is complete. Billions in value erased, hundreds of millions in investor money gone, clinical partners and patients left in the wake, and the founder and COO both in federal prison for fraud. So what's the real money lesson in the Theranos autopsy? According to multiple sources, including CNN Business, the Theranos history, and the SEC's own description of its case, Investors put more than $700 million into a company whose core technology was never independently validated in the way you'd expect for something this critical. Regulators later alleged that Theranos' devices could only run a small fraction of the tests it claimed. Walgreens terminated its relationship in 2016. Theranos had to refund millions in Arizona. CMS barred it from running labs for 2 years. Forbes wiped Holmes's net worth from billions to zero. All of that suggests a simple but brutal truth. Massive checks were written on trust, branding, and fear of missing out, not on transparent, verifiable performance. For you, the viewer, whether you're investing $500 or $5 million, the lesson is this: never let a good story substitute for proof. A charismatic founder, glowing press, and big-name partners are not due diligence. In Theranos' case, according to CNN Business and the SEC's allegations, investors relied heavily on management's claims about what the tech could do, rather than demanding clear, third-party validation of accuracy, reliability, and financial performance. If a company claims to have revolutionary technology, ask what independent tests back it up. Look for regulatory records, approvals, sanctions, or settlements, like the CMS and Arizona AG deals Theranos had to sign. Pay attention to who's vouching for the product, regulators and peer-reviewed data, or just the company's PR team and friendly media. The Theranos story isn't just about one founder's fall. It's a warning about what happens when investors, partners, and customers suspend skepticism because they want the miracle to be real. In the end, according to Theranos' own history, the technology didn't live up to the hype, the money disappeared, and the legal system stepped in. The investors who asked the hard questions early, or stayed out entirely, are the ones who kept their net worth intact. In other words, don't just fall in love with the pitch. Make the numbers prove themselves. Theranos shows how easy it is for billions to vanish when people invest in a compelling story instead of demanding hard evidence. No matter how exciting the pitch, always verify the technology, the numbers, and the regulatory reality before you put your money on the line. If you want more money autopsies like this, the real stories of how fortunes are made and lost, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, what's one too good to be true investment you've walked away from?